Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this installment of our Fall Semester 2013 Sabbatical Speakers Series. I'm Bill Blomquist from the School of Liberal Arts, and the school created this series to showcase the research that faculty do during their sabbatical leaves and to share it with students and with colleagues from their own departments and other departments, with alumni and friends from the community. And today's speaker is Xin Zhang, who is Associate Professor of History here at IUPUI and also a faculty member in the Center for East Asian Studies at IU Bloomington. And Professor Zhang's academic interests include Chinese history, Asian history, and world history. He is the author of numerous journal articles, plus a book, Social Transformation in Modern China, the State and Local Elites in Henan, 1900 to 1937. Professor Zhang serves as a frequent panel member at the Association for Asian Studies conferences and at the American Historical Association conferences. He's earned many honors, including the title of Century Fellow at the University of Chicago. And today, Professor Zhang will present Re-examining the Opium War in China. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
I believe all of you are familiar with the TED Talk.
Yes.
So I'm going to give you a TED Talk, a mini TED Talk today. On the TED Talk, there's a professor, Neil Ferguson. You probably have heard about this professor, who is now giving a lot of talks about the 6 killer apps. What is the 6 killer apps about? It's about the West got ahead of China. Now, there's a whole lot of discussion out there right now talking about the Great Divergence. This conversation actually started years ago. One of the very well-known professor now, and who just happens to be the current president of American Historical Association. What I want to say is that historians do well, okay? Started this conversation, I have a little voice problem, so you forgive me. Started this conversation about the Great Divergence by his book entitled The Great Divergence. Why the Great Divergence? We all know that 15th century, this is, if we think that if we live in 15th century right now, this is what's going to happen. The Chinese are going to sit there and have tea, sit in their house. They don't have pigtails at the time, by the way. Pigtails came later dynasty, the Qing dynasty, Manchurians changed the hairstyle. So they don't have the pigtail, they don't have the Jackie Chan's kind of long sleeves. They will sit there and talk about, Europeans are not so good. We're a lot ahead of them. That was true. That will be true. 15th century. That will be true. Why 15th century onward? China disintegrated into a country that I will talk about during the Opium War. We will see what happened. But European countries spared ahead. That is the question that today many historians are trying to answer. Now, by the way, let me mention this. We're living in an exciting period of history. We're living in an exciting moment of time. Why this is an exciting moment of time? Because in next 10 and 20 years, when we come back to look at this period of time, we're going to say, oh my God, that's a crucial moment of our time in history. Why? Because in 2016, China will become the biggest economy in the world. I'm not making this up, okay? And we are trying to say maybe 2030, China, or we think that the living standard of Chinese will be about the same as the Americans. According to the World Bank, 1970s, average American's life is better 20 times, which means that we are richer 20 times than the average Chinese life. Okay? About 3 and 5 years ago, we're 5 times. Now, we're about 3 times, maybe a little bit more than 3 times. What does that mean? What does that mean? That means that China has already caught up with America. So why we have this conversation? Why we talk about the Great Divergence? Because we want to see what is happening now is the Great Reconvergence. I had the opportunity to talk to Kenneth Pomeroy, who studied this conversation about the great divergence. I said to him that we are in the period of great reconvergence. He said, you're right. I said, that is the reason that we now have this conversation. Now, let's come back and talk about the Opium War. Why Opium War matters first. The Great Divergence, 15th century. 16th, 17th century, Europe, Western Europe, things started to change. Okay? The 6 killer apps, maybe not every one of them is correct, but one of them is correct. Science, technology. When we call technology, it didn't mean that China didn't have a technology. And China didn't have technology. It's just that the mechanized technology that China didn't have. Okay? 18th century, gun. Okay? Think about Jill Diamond's book, Germs, Guns, and Germs and Steel. Okay? He is not a historian. Did he make sense? He makes some sense. I think he makes a lot of sense. But he is not a historian. So we forgive him if he's not a historian. We historians think that we know what to do with the history. So we forgive him. But he did get some points. 18th century, guns. I'm going to talk about, when I talk about Opium War, I'm going to talk about guns. Now, 19th century. When the Europeans arrived in China, and we know Opium War is what occurred. What happened? Let me describe to you. Number one, my research, I need to thank the School of Liberal Arts for giving me this opportunity, the sabbatical leave to finish my book. My book is almost done, and I'm working on the introduction, but introduction supposed to be 200 pages, now it's 300 pages, printed pages, and the introduction is supposed to be like 10 pages, but now it's at least 30 pages, so it's gonna take a long time. And I know when I send it to press, they're gonna say, cut it. So I'll come back, spend another period of time, and painfully cut everything that I wrote and put it in there. I know that's gonna happen. My research involved the Opium War. Why? Two things matters to me. Number one, most of the people who have studied Opium War is a huge topic in Chinese history, and also that so many people have done so much work on the Opium War, and it's kind of a done deal. Anytime you talk about Opium War, you go to a Chinese scholar who studies Chinese history, you say, I'm talking about Opium War. They said, is there anything to talk about? I told them, yes. That's the second thing comes in. Because all these talks that they had in the past were about the national level of change. What I'm talking about is the local level of change. I just talk about inland city, a town in somewhere here, the Yangtze River. Why that gave us some new information? Because most of the Opium War fought along the coast, but they did penetrate into the little city. They invaded the little city. They completely occupied the little city. So I have the diaries. I compare the diaries, the Chinese diaries and the British diaries. You know what happened? That the British soldiers and officers wrote those diaries. They wrote all kinds of things. They like to write diaries. So I get hold of them. And the Chinese wrote diaries. I get hold of them, compare them, put together. That gives me opportunity to examine what actually happening. Let me talk about the Opium War just a little bit. Let me describe the story. I know we historians like to tell stories. Now, about 7,000 British soldiers arrived. Their fleet penetrated along the Yangtze River, penetrated into one place called Zhenjiang, where they encircle the city outside. They fired cannons in the air just to want to scare the Chinese people in there. Chinese have never seen, had the Chinese seen the cannons before? They did. Of course, we all understand that they have invented the gunpowder. Why didn't they come out with a gun and with a cannon and shoot the British? Now, I will talk about that. But one thing we knew is that they did not build the cannon that allowed them to shoot the British. But the British built a cannon that they can shoot the Chinese. They shoot the Chinese. They blasted in the air the huge ships that penetrated into the Yangtze River, and got in there, and the Chinese look at them and say, oh my God, they've never seen something like this. So that day, For whatever reason, eclipses happened on that day. The sun was shade. The Chinese say, "Oh my God!" Now, every single time there's a war, there's always a rumor. I think this is just my statement. It's not something that I've checked. But if there's a war, there's a rumor about, "Oh my God, these people came from some kind of some. They don't know that they come from a foreign country. They think, oh, they must come from some kind of a spirit and some kind. They have a different kind of power. They all came with this multi power, and even the sun goes away." Okay. Now this is what's happening. They went into this town. They saw the Chinese soldiers. When I read those diaries, I was kind of intrigued about this. What I'm intrigued, I actually put them into my book. What I'm intrigued is that I want to know the details, how each side look at each other, how they see the other side for the first time. The British look at Chinese, a line of Chinese, two kinds of soldiers. One is called Manchus, which is from somewhere over there. They are bigger and taller people. And the other part is the Chinese, the Han. What does that mean, Han? I am a Han. So anybody looks like me is a Han in a neighborhood. So we are Han. We are Han. So a large number of Han soldiers, 400 Manchu soldiers. When they look at the Manchu soldiers, the first impression is great soldiers, great uniform, with their weapon. Now let's talk about a weapon. What other weapons Chinese have? Chinese had a gun. We always thought they don't have a gun. Opium War, they saw the gun, they have the knife, they don't know what to do. No, they had a gun. They had a gun. 3 kinds of rifles at that time, period of time. One is called a matchlock, which is old. Okay? 17th century, something called flintlock was used until roughly about 1830s. Then the British invented something called cap lock. And the people who are teaching US history will be familiar because in Civil War in the United States, cap lock is what they use. What's the difference? What's the difference? Now, in order to know this difference, I went to a place called Cabela's. I went into their gun collection. So I said, could I take a look at guns? They look at me, they think I'm nuts. And I said, I'm not a gun enthusiast. I'm writing this book, I have to know the difference of them. Painfully, they come out. You cannot touch them, you can look at them. So I kind of look at them. So then I when the manager is away, the young kid, a young guy who said, I said, hey, can I touch them? He looked and the manager's like, he said, okay. So I kind of touched them. The matchlock, you have to blow this thing, put in there. You all have to clean it and push the bullet in there. Yes, not accurate. You put it in there, you shoot 10 seconds, 5 to 10 seconds, boom, it goes out. You have to aim for 5 to 10 seconds and it goes out. Where did it go? You have to pray because you have a big smoke in front of you. Is that true? Okay, now, flintlock, a little bit better. Boom, maybe 2 to 5 seconds, boom, big smoke. Where it goes, you have no idea. Cap lock. You have this little cap thing that ignites the gunpowder. The bullet, it's called a mini bullet. The mini is not M-I-N-I, it's not small. It's the name of the person who invented it. It's hollow on the back so that it shoots quite accurately. Not only that, it goes at least 200 yards. You can kill someone with 200 yards. The Chinese have the old flintlock they bought from the Portuguese. Not only that, they did not maintain them because they don't have the parts. They don't make the parts. They don't know how to maintain them. They do not know what to do with them. But when they bought them, I think they liked them. They have a demonstration in front of the officials, and boom, they can shoot something. They don't care about kill someone. They want to have this feel of power. Okay, but when they have to fight, when they come out with a gun, they're pointing at the British. They have this yell. When I read the diary that says, you look at them, you see the sun is shining on them, on their uniform. They look so powerful. They have this gun. They have more of the arrow, bow, whatever thing, and that thing. They have this formation. They don't even look at us. We are encroaching on them. We're moving to them. They don't even look at us. They say, hey, British. Don't worry about the British. They are just British. They're just a bunch of foreigner. They don't call them foreigners. They call foreign devils. So they don't even look at them. But when they see that the British actually were coming to them, they want to show them the Chinese power. They did. They have this yell. The yell scared the British somewhat. The British were asking themselves, are we going to fight? Are you going to fight? Officers, of course, we have a better gun. We have all these things. They have to convince themselves. The Chinese started shooting 50 yards. The most they do is 100 yards. Don't even reach the British. The British started shooting 200 yards. At least they reached the Chinese. Can you see that? Okay? 5 minutes later, Chinese dispersed. Why they dispersed? Because they are being hit by the British. The British did not even get injured. But when the British saw that, they started charging. They said, hey, they don't have the gun to kill us. Let's go kill them. So that's the battle. Eventually, they got into the city. They defeated Chinese. They got in the city. They exploded. They blow up the gate of the city. They got in there. Now, what happened in there is this. All of a sudden, they find out these Manchurian soldiers disappear, or the Chinese run away. The soldiers run away. They didn't understand why the Manchurian soldiers disappeared, because the Manchurian soldiers were so brave. Why did they disappear? They actually disappeared so that they could go kill their wife and children. Okay? So a lot of the diary, a lot of the part of a book, what I'm talking about is the suicide. It is the suicide, the killing, all kinds of things. Okay, now. I'm not going to tell you the sad story about the killing so that you will go home and be very, very depressed. So I'm going to come back and talk about what does this Opium War really mean to the Chinese history. That's the question that we've been asked. Number one, we saw at local level, we saw that technology makes difference. The Manchurian soldiers were very brave soldiers. They are as brave as anybody else. Even the British, you know what's interesting? The British look at them from a different kind of perspective. They say, hey, they are honorable soldiers. Why they fought heroically? That's why they like them. The British diary always say they are heroic. And these people in Britain, they will be knighted. But what happened to them is why they were defeated. That's the question. Technology makes difference. Okay? Institution makes difference. What does that mean? The Chinese soldiers, I was talking about 400 Manchurians who fought heroically. And then a large number of Chinese soldiers, they also got into the fight. Why they were so easily defeated? Besides of a gun, besides of the weapon, their commanders were the educated elites. Now let me put it this way. Had I lived in Qing Dynasty, I would have become one of the educated elites, like these people are. Okay? Hopefully, I would be one of those degree holders. Now, I look like I can lead the army to fight, but you actually put me into a situation, I'm going to run first. I don't know how to fight. Never fight a gun in my life. How these commanders direct an army to fight the foreigners? They don't know. Actually, lots of things before the war, before the battle occurred. They did all kinds of preparation. They engaging in all kinds of disagreement, argument about all kinds of how to defend, what do we do. They eventually punish the people who disagree with them. They kill some of the people who actually protest, and they devised those complaints. When the British showed up, none of them worked. Why? They were the educated elite. What I mean is that they wrote well, they can write essays, they can write articles to pass national examination. They have never fought anything. So I consider this institutional defect. Now let's come back to talk about this. What we have seen, in a way, is the result of great divergence. Okay? Think about when Neil Ferguson talks about the 6 killer apps. Okay? He thinks that institution is important. Yes, it is. He thinks that scientific development is important. Yes, it is. So we can see that is the result of that because of the divergence. Chinese, the Western Europeans, they met again at the Opium War. When they have the Opium War, they met again. When they met again, they realized the differences. Now, for years, most of the studies that try to understand Opium War will consider this the beginning of Chinese open to the West. Okay? Does that make sense? It does. If you look from this perspective, that before that, China was not connected with the West. Actually, that statement is false now because we understand that Ian Morris, for example, Stanford University professor, has written a book, Why the West Ruled the World for Today. And he proves, he's archaeologist. He's not historian per se, he is archaeologist. He did all this research and he discovered all these things to show that China actually was connected to the West through, the Silk Road, all these, But Opium War was a time when they actually met, okay, face to face. And also the people living in Zhenjiang, for example, never heard of foreigners, actually met the foreigners. That's what we consider. But is that the opening of China? Yes and no. My other parts of the book will talk about how China was already started to transform itself before the Opium War, economically and all kinds of things. So Opium War, in the sense that enhanced that change or facilitated the change. Okay. Now, the question is today, how do we understand the Opium War? We can understand it either from the perspective of the result of the Great Divergence, or we can understand it as the beginning of the reconvergence. Why do I say that? Because think about this. Because of the Opium War, China was awakened. It's not that the war itself changed the society as much. It's not the war. It's that the war made the Chinese realize that they were behind the European countries. So for that, we think it makes sense. For that, we think the war is significant because it did make the Chinese realize that we are behind them. And Chinese actually did know something about science. There was a period preceding to that war, we call this Jesuits period, because the Jesuits went in China and dealt with, but the Jesuits did not bring all this knowledge. Jesuits, it actually fascinated the emperor of China and it made the emperors really intrigued into their kind of like a clock and those kind of things and calendar and those kind of things. But they did not really impress the people. But by the way, the Chinese emperor never realized that they were foreigners. They thought they were from Xinjiang or somewhere from Mongolia. They look like the Mongolians anyway. And I read the diary, because I was doing this research, I read the diary of Matteo Ricci. You probably have heard of Matteo Ricci. I accidentally discovered a diary written by some local officials in the county, in somewhere over here, when Matteo Ricci was assigned by the emperor to be the chief of that county. Now, most historians think that I'm just joking. They think, did you make them up? Since I read the record, so I think I didn't make up. Because the emperor didn't know who he is. The emperor asked him, who are you? He said, I'm from Italy. Oh, where is it? He said, somewhere in there. Oh, it's in Mongolia. So you're Mongolian. Okay, you're Mongolian. And he said, I'm not Mongolian. It doesn't matter. You're Mongolian. To me, you're Mongolian. So they assigned him the job to be a county chief. And he speaks good Chinese. So he must have done quite well. So he became a county chief. Now, out of that period of time, when Opium War actually occurred, Chinese finally realized that it was not that our country, okay, not that our country is, not only that our country is not the only country in the world, but also that our country is not the most powerful in the world. Now, in order to save time, I'm going to talk about the next thing I want to talk about. How are we supposed to understand Opium War today? How are we going to look at that? Number one, think about that, the beginning of Chinese search for a solution to the problem. Yes, we can. Second, think about that as a Chinese beginning to have a soul-searching process to understand what is wrong with us. Number 3, think about Chinese start to struggle. They have started to struggle. They are going to go through all these struggles. Now, I can think in this way. Opium War made the Chinese realize that they were defeated and realize that there's something wrong with them, so they just started to struggle. That struggle led to nationalism. That struggle led to communist revolution. Think about communist revolution as a part of that struggle. Think about communist revolution as a part of the Chinese struggle to better self, to be an advanced country. They got into a right path or not, that's debatable. That's another show. That's we can talk about that in a different show. However, that's part of the struggle. They struggle. And the Chinese believe in nationalism for a period of time. They believe in anarchism too. They believe in all kinds of things. They finally choose to believe in communism. Why do they believe in communism? Russia became a communist country. Good example for them. There are many, many things. And the peasants worked. Mao Zedong did well. Why he did well? He knew how to play with politics. Let's put it this way. Okay, all of these things worked. But the struggle did not end. The struggle did not end. The struggle continued when I left China in 1984. The struggle really began. Because through all this struggle, the Chinese realized that we have a way to better ourselves. The way is to open our society. Finally, they decided to open their society. When they got into communism, they thought that was the way to catch up with the West and even beat the West. They realized it didn't work. So they actually got into open society. And since then, what is happening in China? They are doing everything they can. What Neil Ferguson was saying is that they downloaded the killer apps. When they downloaded the killer apps, they can take the things they don't want. Okay? 2001, I was invited to meet somebody in Shanghai. Since I'm on a recording, I don't think I will mention the name. Let's say somebody who's high-ranking in China. And I had the opportunity to have a private conversation with this person. I said one thing to this person. I said, at the time, I never heard of Neil Ferguson. I never heard of downloading the killer app. I said, China is having the advantage. The advantage is that a country that is latecomer, the latecomer has its advantage. It can learn. It takes years for somebody to invent something. It takes a shorter amount of time just to learn from this person. We all know that. Somebody can invent a computer for many years, just like we can invent some kind of a technology, and somebody comes around in 2 years figure out how we do that. This person was very smart. When this person said this to me, that we understand that, we know that, but it's just we cannot say that. Because if we say that, we're going to have another great leap forward movement. You probably have heard 1958, then later on they have a great leap forward movement in China that people thought they were moving into communism within a few years. So they ate all the seeds, they all kinds of things. You have heard of that. And what happened was that right after that, there was a huge disaster and a crisis. Famine and all comes in, and China had a real disaster because of that. So this person said to me that we cannot talk about that. Even we know that, we cannot say that. Because if we say that, we're going to have another movement because people will be over enthusiastic. When I come back, I was a little amazed. I was really amazed. Why I was amazed? Because I thought the Chinese government did not know. They not only did, they are in control. Today, if you look at China, if you look at the country, you will realize they are changing fundamentally of the country. Just by today, if you look at the news, Xi Jinping is going to change the ownership, the peasants' ownership. It has been a great discussion in China about whether we should let the peasants own the land. And they're moving into that direction. Not only that, but also they are adopting the US, all these regulations, law and the patent regulation, all these things that they are just downloading the killer apps, if you want to say it in that way. They are just learning everything from West, selectively, by the way. That is the reason today, I think, starts from the Opium War. We see that China has now come close to America. Now, what is the lesson? Opium War as a lesson for Americans. Number one lesson, a country does not move forward will collapse. A country, we are talking about reconvergence. Are we going to have another great divergence? When we're going to have another great divergence, who knows who is going to go ahead? This is the conversation I think this country needs to have. So Opium War has shown us, if we do not develop science, we will be defeated. Secondly, Opium War also showed us that institution is important. If we do not have an advanced institution, we will be in trouble. Yes, it is. And all these things we talk about in this country, about education, reform, I just read one report that says that recently Washington, D.C. and Tennessee were the two places, the only two places where the students actually had better grades and better test scores on the reading, math, and everything else. And they say these two places just happen to be, one is the place Mashori used to be, another one is somebody Mashori is closely associated with in Tennessee, is an education commissioner. Okay? Now, as we see this, as we look from the perspective of Opium War in China, we see that in America, we are facing a situation that is kind of close to the situation that China had before the Opium War. They were very conceited, they were very satisfied, they thought they were the greatest country in the world, they thought they are the only country in the world that will have all this power. They look at the West, still laughing at us until the Opium War occurred. So I would like to pose this question to you all, is that what we're going to do about this? I know what I will do about this. When I finish my book, I will dedicate myself to answer that question of what we do about this. Okay, I'm open for the questions. Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
The process that you described after the Opium War, how did it play out at that local scale that you were talking about? How do I see that in something like a village or a part of China that's distinct from the whole country?
The Opium War, several things occurred during that period of time. One is that the government did not really understand what was going on in the opium business. There are several things that are involved in this. Number one is officials were so afraid if they report to the emperor what was going on, they will be either kicked out of the job, they will be killed, or they will be punished, or something. So they started reporting all these false news. So the emperor most of the time was kept by those kind of bad news. The emperor only knew, actually it was Emperor's daughter, only knew that we were doing okay. We're doing good. We're defeating foreigners. We're defeating foreigners, actually. That was what's happening. And we're defeating foreigners. This is. Second thing is that when the British keep on pushing, there's one thing I realized that's interesting. The British, why did they want to invade inland China, a little town? They want to teach Chinese a lesson. In the diary, they said, our mission is to teach Chinese a lesson. Now, what does that mean, teach Chinese a lesson? It means that they want to show the Chinese how to be civilized. That's the idea. The idea is to bring China to the world. That's the idea. They think that by teaching them a lesson, Chinese will know how to behave like a nation in the world. Now, There are many scholarship actually focus on this kind of issue of how Chinese become a part of the world and become a world of nations. China never thought of itself being a part of the world. China thought of itself as what we call a tiansha, which means the heaven, under the heaven. What does that mean? That China believes itself to be the only country in the world, or the center of the earth. And it does not believe that there is anything else that matters to them. So that they do not understand that. So some people will say that because of this war, they begin to realize there are actually a country versus many other countries. That is true. China did learn how to deal with other countries. But for the local people, to answer your question, for the local people, number one, they didn't care about any of these things. They didn't care how the Chinese emperor sees himself, or how China is supposed to deal with the rest of the world. They don't care about this. They only care about one thing. Why these foreigners will never know who they are, never see them, because the local people never see them. And before that, no foreigner will ever get into inland China. When they saw the foreigners, not only these people come humongous, they think they're humongous because they're tall. I'm a very tall Chinese. If I live at that period of time, they will consider me as a foreigner because I'm tall, I think. Agree? Yes. So I'm very tall Chinese, by the way. Milk is good. Now, so they've never seen Chinese. Second thing is they never comprehend ideas of having beer. They always think that people have beer, actually grow their head connected with their chest. Okay? Number three, they had no idea about the gun power that British come. Of course, when they came, they was going to slaughter the Chinese. Chinese will be killed by them, of course, because Chinese were no match with them. Okay? Some of the things that I try to talk about in my book, I don't want to get too detailed about this because I think it's too of a research type of thing, is how the people actually, through this ordeal or experience, how the people, for the first time, negatively became connected with the rest of the world. So the title of the chapter is the Opium War is the negative form of liaison. That's the title, okay. What does that mean? Because in the past, we talked quite a bit about the idea of globalization. When I started this project, before I started this project, I spent quite a few years reading everything I could. Everything about all these theories, whatever it is. Then finally I decided that globalization is something that I will get into. So I read lots of globalization theory, all kinds of things. So I wanted to see how these people, for the first time, the local people, were connected to the rest of the world negatively by this ordeal. Do you know what's happening? Just by the time I'm almost finishing this book, globalization has collapsed. Is it in crisis? You realize this, right? Globalization is in crisis. If my book goes to globalization, I guarantee people will say, it's belonged to the 1990s. So historians do have difficulties in life because history changes too fast. We cannot keep up with this. So today, what we actually have the chance to look at, of course, it is the first time local people accidentally got into this mess. But on the other hand, because of this war, local people for the first time were negatively connected with the rest of the world. How does that fundamentally change their lives? Of course, it changed their life greatly. It gave them the impression that for all foreigners are evil. It also gave the impression that all foreigners, they intend to come and kill. Even though lots of that was suicide, they still consider that a consequence of the war. So that I would consider to be a negative form of liaison. That I think that's, hopefully that answers the question. Go ahead.
I just have a question about, I really enjoyed the talk in placing the Opium War within the history of the relationship between China and the West. Is it the end of this divergence or the beginning of reconvergence? My question has to do with a sort of collective memory. Because
that's interesting.
You mentioned that at some point you have the British fleet, they're making some inroads into mainland China through the Yangtze River, and then they have their vessels, and the Chinese just marveled at the size of the vessels. But I had the impression that in the 15th century, when the Chinese are interested in kind of discovering the world,
Yes.
The admiral, the Chinese admiral,
Zheng He.
I mean, he had a fleet that kind of dwarfed
Right.
Santa Maria and all of
Yes,
these ships.
that is correct.
So how could they, seeing those British vessels, think that, that they were great, that they were awesome, when they themselves had vessels that were just
Okay.
bigger, much bigger?
Yeah. Let me say a few words about that. That's very interesting because last minute I added one chunk of the thing to talk about that because I think I have to tell people about the boat. Chinese were ahead of the Europeans to some degree. Let me say this. The knowledge about using watercraft, boats, building the boats, Chinese were very advanced. Middle Eastern countries were very advanced. Okay? Europeans were advanced too. Europeans learned the ideas from Middle Easterners. Middle Easterners learned the idea from Chinese. Chinese learned somewhat from the Middle Easterners. They all share those ideas. How do they share this idea is one of the questions, is that they met on the ocean. They met on the ocean. Okay? Now, Chinese were advanced in many areas. They eventually can build large ship. Now, since you mentioned about Zheng He's ship is so large that when Zheng He goes out, the fleet carries 30,000 people, not on one boat. They plant vegetables on the boat. Okay? They have the bulkhead, so it's unsinkable. It's the notion they learned from the Chinese bamboo. If anybody knows about bamboo, you cut the bamboo. You see, oh, that's interesting. They are the compartments that actually holds by itself. So eventually it's unsinkable. Chinese had this idea. So the Titanic learned from the Chinese of that idea. Yes. No, the movie people won't say that. They say that's not true. But that is true. So the Chinese built a big ocean voyager and they can go anywhere. Now there's a huge argument about did the Chinese discover America before Columbus? I have looked into that to some degree. I cannot definitely say the Chinese discovered America before Columbus did. I can say one thing, that a lot of people discovered America before Columbus, but they just went unknown. Nobody cared. Columbus actually advertised America to the Europeans. So the Europeans get to know about America. They know that you can go in there and there's a territory you can explore. But the Chinese, for whatever reason, okay, by mid-15th century, about 1430 or something, the emperor decided that China was going to end all of that activities. They just, now, policy is important. Just end it. Because several reasons. Number one is that China was facing the piracy on the East Coast. Okay? The piracy. Now, a lot of people say the pirates were Japanese pirates. We call them Wako. That's not necessarily true. I've done quite some of a study of that. Some Chinese disguising as a Japanese, they rob other people too. So it's Chinese and Japanese and everybody else, okay, who became pirates. So he decided to do that. Secondly, there was an internal fight about wasting money. Why do we spend so much money? Have all this money? When we discover, because this notion is always there for the Chinese. The notion is that what you discover is the extension of Chinese culture, or the marginal culture that it changes upon the Chinese culture, or the peripheral Chinese culture. Why do we bother to find them? Because of that idea. So, idea does make difference. China never want to discover, never want to extend their reach to the rest of the world. They never really wanted, mid-15th century, they all of a sudden stopped. Also, they call this maritime ban. There was a maritime ban. By that time, Chinese had shipbuilding facilities that can build huge ship. One of them is called sand boat. Huge, travel on the ocean, relatively stable. Now, if we talk about boat, there are different kinds of boat, but it's a flat bottom boat, and it's relative, if it's large enough, relatively stable. Okay, now the boats have a V shape and all kinds of things. Not kind of things that we're talking about. I mean, the little ones, the bigger ones, okay, most of them, okay. And then, because of this ban, China will not allow their people to build those large size ships anymore. Did it die? Not really. The Southeast Asians picked it up. Who are the Southeast Asians? They're the Chinese migrants. They moved to the Southeast Asian country. Now, part of the reason is that wood became expensive in China. Wood became expensive in Europe. Wood became expensive all over the world, I think. Especially it was expensive in China. So the Chinese rely on the Southeastern builders, and many of them, Chinese transfer the technology, but it's out of country. By the time when the British came, think about this. We can see the cars, but if 2 generations later, car is outdated, you tell them we used to have a car, they think that we're crazy. They cannot imagine that. The people never seen a big boat. So after that, they have the little ones, small ones, and the city that I'm talking about also border on the crossroad of China. They call this because it's on the Grand Canal. Grand Canal serves as kind of a highway. Now, what this Grand Canal actually does is that it connects those rivers. And there are some small streams, and it connects the tributary of those rivers. So that all connected by the Grand Canal. So this place that I'm talking about, why I think it's significant, because I think it is Indianapolis in China. Right? Okay. Any other question?
I have a question.
Yes.
So when the British arrived, they came from India, right? The British ruled India. And weren't a lot of the troops with them actually Indians?
That's true. That's true. A lot of Indians. That's true. Africans too.
And so then how did the Chinese, based on the diaries you read, how did they view these people who came? They weren't all British. They were the British and their colonists.
That's a very interesting part of it. Let me talk about the Chinese, how they view them. Chinese learn to differentiate the white foreign devil, the brownish foreign devil, okay, and the black foreign devil, they call that, okay, because they're Africans. They immediately knew that Africans were the people who work on the ship, do not get into the battle. They knew that Indians got into the battle to some degree, but when they actually got into the fight, it was the British who actually got into the fight. Okay, the Indians did a lot of things like moving cannon, whatever it is. How did the Chinese perceive them? This is one of the interesting things that I noticed. They got into the city, they broke into the city, immediately there was chaos. The soldiers started taking stuff from Chinese home, they looted Chinese home, okay? And a lot of people are dead because of community suicide or whatever happened. The Chinese were looting too, the locals were looting. Okay, now my research might be quite different from most people's research that has done, but when they look at this, they say, you are just talking nonsense. But I'm going to show them so that I have to prove to them I'm not talking nonsense. In the diary that I saw the people talk about the neighbors who used to be jealous about these rich people got involved with looting. The relatives who are jealous about their cousin get rich let people into their house, cousin's house, and engage themselves in looting. Now, this is what's happening. The British immediately wanted to restore the order. The commander immediately said, you cannot loot. Our soldiers do not loot. So he established an order. Now, this is what's interesting part. First person he published is an African. He will bring the Africans out if they participate in looting, have them punished, beat up, or even have them shot in front of people. Second kind of people that come out are the Indians. Did they ever put a British soldier? No, they didn't. They didn't punish the British soldier. So they rather punish, can you see how identity plays a role in this? They didn't punish the British people. They actually punished the Indians and Africans. That's, when they punish the Chinese, of course, they punish any Chinese. They don't care who that is.
Well, if you look at Chinese history, you can see there are two significant when the Chinese is open, to the world, or there's a meet between the East and the West. And so one is like you talk about the Opium War, and the other one is the early 1980s or late
1979. Yes.
And the open door policy, the China stopped isolation from the rest of the world,
Right.
open door to pretty much to the Western world. And from what the people most common common people think about this is more like the differences between the two big moments. In terms of the Opium War, the influence or exposure to the Western world is pretty much kind of imposed on the Chinese people.
That is true.
But look at what happened recently in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The Chinese are open. The door is open to the Western world willingly. Not only the government, but with the policy was made by the government. But that's it's pretty much in accordance follow the will of the Chinese people. So I was just thinking whether there's some kind of similarities.
Yes, yes.
That's your topic.
Yes. I want to see that as a part of the Chinese struggle to recapture the power they want to have and to catch up with the rest of the world or the Europeans or the West. The term of the West is not a very good term, but we use that regardless because there's no better term for that. And I would rather see that now. I am sure that you have experienced that too. Think about 1979. One of the things occurred in China that there was a consensus among the Chinese that communism is not going to work. Right? 79 emerging consensus. We actually lived through that period of time as an exciting moment of history. Okay? Consensus. Okay? It was a consensus that communism is not going to bring us to anywhere. It's not because the Chinese, most people, I would say, why the communists succeeding in China? Part of the reason is because there are many discussions, many books are written on the subject. Part of the reason is the strategy, take advantage of the enthusiasm of the peasants or mobilize the peasants and all of that. But there's one important reason that people do not talk so much about is that most of Chinese have this tendency, or not, when we say most, I do mean that most of the peasants because they do not know much about this. But most of the intellectuals, they have this feeling that somehow communism is right for China. That kind of atmosphere, that kind of idea was there. That's why the communists, for whatever reason, had a broader support from the country than the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek. Now, that's the reason I want to put them into a perspective of this Chinese struggle. Starts from the realization of the defeat, realization of their backwardness, to the point where they are now. Right now is that they are taking those kind of paths to see which one fits them, which one works. When the communists, when they went through a cultural revolution or an anti-racist movement, all these movements, not only they're tired, but also they come to the realization that it's not working. Remember 1979, if you want to convince someone that communism will work, it's very difficult. And I would say, even during the Cultural Revolution, if you try to tell people that communism is not going to work, it will be very difficult to convince people that. I think most people still believe communism is the right way to change the country. But by 1979, it's almost the common idea. And it was a huge, most people were talking in private, of course. We're talking about, it's not going to work, communism is not going to work. So by 1980s, it became so obvious. There was a discussion in China in 1980s, which the discussion about Chinese culture, what's wrong with the Chinese culture. That discussion is meaningful because that discussion not just talk about what's wrong with the communism, it talked about what's wrong with Chinese culture. It was the idea that we have done everything wrong. We went into so many wrong paths. It was the re-examination of ourselves, of the Chinese themselves, about what happened during Cultural Revolution, all of that. All of these things actually led to China's openness today. And I think Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping, of course, okay? Jiang Zemin has said something important. He actually allowed that period of time to be a period of time that China actually began to re-emerge in the world. And now Xi Jinping has a big job to do. Can he continue that is a question. Can China continue that? And what Xi Jinping is doing now is very obvious, that he is continuing that direction. He's not changing back, because there are so many talks. And before Xi Jinping became the president, I was interviewed by Chinese media, all kinds of newspapers and magazines. They asked me the same questions. Do you think Xi Jinping is going to turn it back to the Mao era? My answer is this. Can he turn that back to the Mao era? He cannot, because nowadays they realize that this world is not the old world of China. And control will work in this world. This world is interesting. Now, think about this. Internet has done great things for the world. Not just for technology-wise that you can look for things. It has done great things in terms of democracy. Because it puts information in the hands of everybody. Is the Chinese government blocking all these things, access? Yes, they can. They can. But it's very difficult to control. As long as it's internet, it's very difficult. Okay? They can ban some sites, but next day something pops up. It is very difficult. Can they say, you cannot use their phone? They cannot. So the world is changed. And Xi Jinping realized this. The Chinese government realizes this. So now China is changing. They are changing by the wave. They are following this wave of change, I think. Okay, thank you so much.